On July 10th, 1981, the small town of Skidmore, Missouri saw its own brand of justice. Local terrorizer Ken McElroy was shot and killed in broad daylight while sitting inside his car. There were dozens of witnesses. According to reports, there were around 50 people outside the tavern, including McElroy's wife, Trina, when the gunshots began. There was no denying that Ken McElroy was murdered there on that very day. But over the next 4 decades, something unheard of happened. Nobody came forward with information. Everyone present at the event, some 50 people, claimed they hadn't seen a thing. Then after a year-long investigation, the FBI closed its files on September 1st, 1982, without returning any indictments. McElroy's death opens up genuinely uncomfortable questions. What does a town's silence say about its community's identity or its psychology? The event resulted not only in an FBI investigation that was chronicled in the national press, but also in numerous books, a documentary, and even a TV movie. The secret this town shared formed an involuntary bond amongst its residents, even for those who weren't alive in the 1980s. And now, as you could imagine, it's a foundational myth as part of Skidmore's identity. As for the man himself, was it the system that created Skidmore's most notorious bully? We'll dive deep into McElroy's past as a child of extreme rural poverty, lack of education, and his large, marginalized family that taught him early how intimidation was not only a survival mechanism, but a tool to wield for power and upward mobility. But the biggest question that this story presents is, when is enough enough? What happens when institutions fail? What happens when something needs done and someone needs to do it? Is community enforcement or mob justice, even to the point of murder, a legitimate form of self-defense? The public execution of Ken McElroy has sparked fascinating asymmetry between outsiders and Skidmore's residents. The question of how could you and how could you not? And it prompts a conversation about what justice means and the shades of gray between it. So before we get to the events of July 10th, 1981, I just want to say hello everybody, and today we're talking about the town-wide murder of Ken McElroy. This story has always fascinated me, and as you're going to see throughout this video, I certainly have some opinions about it. People often talk about cases where someone takes justice or revenge into their own hands, but rarely does that follow out over the course of several decades where everyone keeps their mouth shut. But today we're going to be talking about that exact thing happening. And we're going to talk about what happened for an entire community to be that fed up. So if all that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about a murder committed by about 50 people and no witnesses. If you like this channel, then you're probably familiar with things that go bump in the night, but you don't have to be one of them, thanks to today's sponsor, Helix Sleep. A lot of us have probably had the same mattress and bedding for years, and we just stick with it because it's good enough. But considering you spend about a third of your life asleep, it's probably not something you want to take for granted. Thankfully, Helix is here to help. If you don't know where to start, then you can start with Helix's sleep quiz. You answer a lot of questions about yourself and how you prefer to sleep, and then they partner you with the mattress that's best for you. For me, someone who prefers a kind of firm mattress and sleeps on their side, they partnered me with the Helix Midnight Luxe. For one, getting a mattress into your house has never been easier. The mattress comes rolled up, and as you unpack it, it expands. Now I have a mattress that fits me, not a mattress I have to figure out how to sleep comfortably on. It supports me in the same position that I feel comfortable. And because I sleep more comfortably, my sleep is more effective, meaning a more productive day follows. During the summer months, staying cool is hard enough, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you how miserable it can be if you can't get cool while trying to go to bed. But as someone who's used to sleeping with a fan pointed at them, I can tell you that thanks to Helix's Glaciotex material, you can stay cool all night long. Plus, Helix is so confident you'll like your mattress that they have a 120-night sleep trial with seamless returns and exchanges. It goes to show why they keep winning awards from Forbes, USA Today, and more. And you can not only get in on Helix's mattress, but their Comfort Adjust cooling pillow. Similar to mattresses, we often compromise when it comes to pillows, but the Comfort Adjust cooling pillow lets you remove or add material to your preference. Plus, the Glaciotex heat conductive fabric ensures that the cool side of the pillow is both sides all night long. Most pillows and mattresses are one size fits all, but your body is not. And sleep is far too important to settle with good enough. So you can sleep settled instead of settling thanks to Helix Sleep. And right now is the perfect time to get in on their offer. That's because right now, if you head to the link in the description at helixsleep.com/Wendigang, you can take advantage of their 4th of July sale and get 20% off site-wide. That is right, 20% off thanks to their 4th of July sale at the link in the description at helixsleep.com/Wendigang. And be on the lookout for additional sales on the Helix site. Thank you to Helix for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So, to begin, Ken Rex McElroy was born on June 16th, 1934, smack in the middle of the Great Depression. Despite Franklin D. Roosevelt's inauguration, America's economy was still in decline, with nearly a quarter of the country's population unemployed. McElroy was child number 15 out of 16, born to Tony and Mabel McElroy. 14-year-old Mabel Marie Lister had married 22-year-old Tony Watt McElroy in 1920. And yes, Ken's mom was 14 when she married his 22-year-old father. I know people will make jokes about like back in the 20s and 30s, this kind of weirdness was common and whatever, still weird, still very strange. Tony was known as Tone to his family and was also infamous for a hot temper. As a young man, he made moonshine, drank too much of it, and got into fights, mostly over women. The couple worked as tenant farmers, residing and working on land owned by landlords. For the first 13 years of his life, Ken McElroy grew up living in someone else's house, as children of tenant farmers do. He would work on somebody else's land for a family struggling to survive. The bitterness of these harsh years would never leave McElroy, or maybe it was his father, Tony, who once openly stated to a Skidmore banker that Ken was never his favorite child, which seeded a darkness in the young boy. In fact, Tony had made a list for the banker of which of his kids were fine and which kids to avoid, and Ken was always in the latter group. Regardless if Ken already exhibited violent signs from a young age or not, his father certainly didn't help. Tony and Mabel moved the family frequently, from eastern Kansas to the southern Missouri Ozarks, and finally to northwest Missouri just outside the town of Skidmore. The family packed itself in a 2-bedroom house. Ken and the youngest child of the family, Timmy, slept in one bed next to 2 older brothers in another. Ken and Timmy were close for a while, as the 2 youngest kids in a crowded house tend to be, but Tony's preference for Timmy created a distance between the 2 youngest boys. Unlike Ken, who was constantly getting yelled at by his father, Timmy's sweet disposition and initiative for household chores like feeding the pigs or sweeping the floor kept the baby of the family on Tony's good side. As for McElroy's relationship with his siblings, other than an older sister named Dorothy, everyone tended to leave him alone. Even his father, Tony, backed off when McElroy grew into his early teenage years and let him do whatever he wanted. If there was a sibling Ken McElroy modeled after, it would be an older brother who allegedly went to jail for stealing corn. In his spare time, Ken liked trapping animals, possums, skunks, and beavers, and would regularly check his traps on the way to school from his farm. In the 5th grade, McElroy's teacher took him down to the basement and tried to clean him and his clothes because he smelled so strongly of skunk. More than once, he was sent home because his scent was too unbearable. School and formal education were never strong points of emphasis in McElroy's life, and that same year, the 5th grade, he seldom went to school at all. According to teachers, Ken never did his homework, paid little attention or interest to what was going on in class, and kept to himself. When other kids participated in school activities like sports or going to the cafe to play pool, McElroy would often be found alone with his dogs checking traps. He was also unusually strong and could have been a star athlete. During recess football, no one could bring McElroy down, and he could throw a basketball across the court as if it were a baseball. But McElroy was difficult to manage and was mean to his teachers. New students who came to school were instructed to stay away from McElroy. Because of poor grades and skipping classes, he was held back twice in the 5th grade. By the time he made it to the 6th grade, his younger brother Timmy had caught up. But one thing Ken did have going for him was his size, as he was by far the biggest kid in the class, at least 3 or 4 inches over the others. Looking back, no other students or teachers could remember an incident where McElroy actually physically assaulted another student, and maybe he didn't need to. Perhaps his size and posture was enough to keep others away. Ken McElroy was also famously known around town for stealing and trespassing. When he was caught stealing from a gas station grocery store in Graham, the owner made the distinct mistake of calling his father. Later that day, Ken's dad, Tony, stormed into the store with a hunting knife in hand and held the owner against the wall. Tony snarled, quote, "If you ever touch my boy again, I'll cut your heart out." While in isolation, aside from maybe the hyperviolence, you could think of a father standing up for his son as something positive. Keep in mind, this is a violent, alcoholic father defending his son from theft, or his son's consequences for committing theft. Not only is that antithetical to Ken learning better, but it's teaching Ken something that he'll use for the rest of his life. If you want something, just be violent about it. After school, Ken McElroy would ride his strawberry roan horse wherever he pleased. The custom was to ask permission from a landowner before riding across their property, but McElroy never bothered to ask. The entire world, from his perspective, was his own personal backyard. And if there was a fence blocking his passage, Ken used a pair of wire cutters to snip it down. One time, a farmer challenged Ken for hunting on his land without permission, but the 14-year-old boy told him nobody was going to tell him what to do. Maybe it was by coincidence, or the freedom of not dealing with a problematic student, that Ken McElroy was finally passed on through junior high, despite not learning to read or write. But it would be in the 7th grade that McElroy would meet a boy named John L., whose influence fostered bad behavior, particularly towards a group that most middle school boys wreaked havoc on: girls. McElroy and John would often ride horses to fool around with girls in town. But with the duo's reputation, many of these girls were forbidden to associate with the boys, but the ones who were attracted to them managed to meet them secretly after school and during the weekends. McElroy's domestic issues weren't exactly a secret. Whenever John would spend the night, he'd often hear the sounds of the parents fighting and arguing. John particularly felt sympathetic towards Mrs. McElroy. Mabel was repressed, never being seen in so much as a new dress, and John would later see his friend Ken as someone who never overcame the fact that he was poor. But it's hard to overcome poverty when you refuse to do good work. When Ken and John found jobs at a nursery in Iowa, 15-year-old McElroy got in trouble after he was caught fooling around with a young coworker. McElroy acquired a 1936 Ford, which required him to pay for gas and repairs. So rather than, making money to pay for those repairs, this just meant that Ken started stealing. I mean, he was already stealing, but now he was stealing more frequently to fix the car. His preferred target was usually grain from nearby farms. McElroy and John would remove the back seat to fill the rear of his car with grain and unload it for cash the following morning. No questions asked. Sometimes they would siphon gas in the middle of the night from tractors or work trucks left out in fields. Instead of paying for a new transmission for his Ford when it went out, McElroy stole one when they saw another one sitting out in a farmyard. This life of theft and disdain for working a real job paved the way for how Ken operated. He didn't go to school, he didn't work, but he still craved a quintessential part of being an adult: marriage. It's just that his definitions of that are far different from that of you or I. In 1952, 18-year-old Ken McElroy married Olita, a 16-year-old girl from St. Joe. The couple moved to Denver to be closer to one of McElroy's sisters, who helped him get a job working construction. This job would be McElroy's last attempt to be an upstanding citizen. One day, McElroy suffered a serious injury at a work site when a cribbing form fell from 30 feet and hit him on the head. Ken's safety helmet shattered and cut his scalp. The accident caused the nerves and muscles in his neck to jam, causing episodes of heavy pain and blackouts that would afflict him for the rest of his life. In fact, McElroy told people that a steel plate was implanted in his head, which they blamed for his frequent outbursts and violent behavior. After their 6-month stint in Colorado, where Olita had a stillborn child, the McElroys moved back to Missouri. Ken would steal hogs and calves to sell at markets, a much easier way of making a living compared to physical labor. Meanwhile, his childhood friend John had joined the Navy at 17. When the two reconnected, John found McElroy living in, quote, a squalid flat in St. Joe, where Ken was too embarrassed of Olita to introduce her to John. While back in his home state, McElroy's sinister reputation would only grow. It didn't take that much time of Ken living around the area he already had a reputation for being violent and stealing, of him continuing to be violent and stealing, for rumors to begin to swirl. There were whispers that McElroy had raped a 14-year-old girl from Quitman, that she had become pregnant and died giving birth to twins at home because a hospital delivery was too expensive. According to the rumors, McElroy returned a year later and raped the girl's older sister, who ended up marrying one of his hunting buddies. Now, we're not sure where these rumors came from initially, but as we're going to see later in the story, it wouldn't be too far out of character. What we do know for a fact is because of these stories and stories similar to them, whenever Ken McElroy's name was brought up, a sense of fear soon followed. A 17-year-old girl named Barbara would often see McElroy, or Kenny as she and her girlfriend would come to know him, at a local bar in Burlington Junction near Quitman. He was a muscular, good-looking man with dark hair and dark blue eyes who would sit at the bar alone or play pool. Barbara frequently partied with McElroy and would join him and other young girls, much younger than her and her girlfriend, at other bars in other towns. McElroy would tell Barbara and her friend that they need not worry about him. He'd say, quote, "You're too old for me. I like my women younger and tender. I like that young meat." But, oh my gosh. I mean, as this story is going to go on, it's going to get worse and worse. This is just like an appetizer for where it's going. But it's wild that even when he was being normal, he was still monstrous. Keep in mind, he's telling a 17-year-old girl that she's way too old for him. So just how young was Ken's preference? About 13 or 14. One 13-year-old girl, Donna, often snuck out at night to see McElroy. Donna lived with her grandparents, who owned a tavern nearby, which McElroy often drank at. One night, when he was drinking there with some other girls, McElroy teased the grandfather, asking how the farm was doing and how Donna was. The old man lost his temper, knowing that his granddaughter, who was again 13 years old, had been seeing Ken, so the old man screamed at McElroy to stay away from his granddaughter. On the ride home, McElroy told the girls that they were going to Donna's farmhouse to burn it down. They ended up in Donna's kitchen, but instead of burning it down, they ate bologna sandwiches and drank whiskey. And a year later, the 14-year-old Donna gave birth to McElroy's son. It's always interesting to me to hear people's reaction to this story because they hear the opening detail of like, wow, 50 people murdered a guy and they all agreed to it. And, you know, over the decades, no one confessed or said they saw who did it. That's crazy. That must have been a really wacky set of circumstances. And then they start to hear details about Ken and they're progressively like, oh, I get it. Also, keep in mind, he's still married to Alita through this and is apparently so embarrassed of her that he just doesn't take her out anywhere and doesn't even introduce his childhood friend to her. I know that we're in a realm where infidelity is like lower on the list of concerns, but I just want to keep in mind how many people are being hurt at several different levels by his actions. The adults in these towns questioned why he roamed around unpunished and decided to stay away from him and the places he frequented. For the wealthier residents, this was easy. McElroy preyed upon the poor and the rural community, his people. They had little to no influence, and more importantly, they didn't have lawyers. Sure, there are sympathies with Ken's upbringing. You can understand that he had a troubled childhood. Regardless of how you feel about him as a child, as a grown man, he is just as monstrous to the same group of people he once was, and still is. Only now, he's literally bigger, so he gets to bully them around. In 1958, Olita agreed to a divorce from McElroy, who found his second wife, a 15-year-old girl named Sharon from St. Joe. McElroy and Sharon started fooling around together not long after he came back from Colorado, and their marriage was largely in part out of self-preservation. How was divorcing his wife and marrying a 15-year-old girl an act of preservation? Well, one evening, McElroy and Sharon were arguing in his pickup, and he pulled out a shotgun to threaten her. The gun accidentally went off and tore off the bottom of Sharon's chin. After shooting a 15-year-old girl in the face, the first thing McElroy did was tell his wife, Olita, that he would, quote, have to divorce her and marry Sharon to avoid prosecution for assault with a deadly weapon. It took like more than 1 year to kill this guy. Could you just imagine that you had a 15-year-old daughter, and not only is this guy hooking up with her, but then he shoots her in the head, doesn't kill her, and then marries her to avoid a conviction? I'm mad even considering that. Sharon, who gave birth to his son a year after her marriage to McElroy, both loved and feared Ken. Ken's sister Helen once visited. She deemed that their son, Jerome, was neglected by both McElroy and Sharon. When Ken nearly ran Jerome over in the driveway, Helen decided it was enough. She took Jerome back to California with her a few years later. In 1961, Sharon and her daughter Tammy Jo showed up at the sheriff's office and explained how Ken had locked them in the house for several days. Sharon was relieved to have escaped, but even more scared at the thought of what her husband might do to her when he found out. Sharon told the sheriff about the beating she suffered when McElroy lost his temper. A social worker was called to the office and arranged for both Sharon and the baby to stay with the foster family. While she was away, she found out that McElroy had brought home another girl, a 14-year-old named Sally. At this, Sharon wanted out. The prosecution team filed a complaint against McElroy, charging him with abusing Sharon. The sheriff's office were ready to execute an arrest warrant, but somehow, McElroy found out that Sharon was staying at the social worker's house and went over to talk to her. He convinced her not to go through with the complaint, telling her that he would even bring Jerome back from California. Sharon obliged and told the prosecutor to drop the charges. Sharon's foster family heard that McElroy beat her badly that evening. So he's an abusive husband to his child brides who he keeps impregnating and either abandoning the children or causing the children such a horrible state of living that relatives are taking the kids away. And when one of these child brides tries to press charges, he convinces them with his fist to return back. It's hard to even imagine a worse person. McElroy's relationship with these two women is just a microcosm of a trail of destruction, pain, and abuse he left behind in his wake. By this time, Ken had both teenage girls living under his roof, and at one point, both Sharon and Sally were in the hospital at the same time, each delivering one of McElroy's children. In total, he had 7 children with Sharon and Sally. Sharon gave birth in 63, 64, and 65, while Sally gave birth in 61, 63, and 64. It was also during this time that McElroy had fine-tuned his thieving. He had a network of girls who lived on farms that would take his stolen livestock and sell them at the markets using their own names. Later, McElroy would stop by to collect and give them some money as payment. Women, in McElroy's mind, were not people. They were merely objects to be used for sex and money. This would become no clearer than for McElroy's next victim, Alice Wood, a 15-year-old drugstore clerk in St. Joe. Alice was instantly attracted to the charming man who could afford anything he wanted in the store. In 1964, when Sharon was still pregnant and Sally was in charge of the newborns, McElroy left both women and moved in with Alice. What she hoped would be a blissful life with her dream man turned into a nightmare. McElroy would often be gone for days, sometimes weeks, without a word. He never explained where he went and was free to come and go as he pleased. This wasn't the same for Alice. She was expected to be there for him whenever he returned, and if she asked questions, Alice risked a beating. By 1968, Alice was no longer the naive young girl who idolized McElroy. She saw him for what he was, a monster who treated women like possessions. She learned that when McElroy had a new girlfriend, his temper calmed down, and he would even be nice to Alice. She realized that, quote, his real need for women was not sexual, but to boost his ego. Similar to McElroy's childhood friend John, who felt that McElroy could never overcome the fact that he came from poverty, Alice also felt Ken's need to prove to himself that he was more of a man than his contemporaries, and the only way he could show for it was by collecting women like trophies. For McElroy, this meant the younger, the better. But it was even more satisfying to him to sleep with women whose husbands were financially better off than him. Spouses of rich farmers and ranchers were prime targets. In fact, he would brag to Alice that, quote, he was really doing those men a favor by keeping their wives satisfied. Once again, the state of Missouri, really cool you eventually killed this guy and all, but you had a lot of time to do it. There was a lot of earlier opportunities, could have saved a lot of people, a lot of headache, but better late than never, I guess. By the time he was in his mid-30s, Ken McElroy had fathered nearly 10 children and had 2 women, Alice and Marcia, sharing his bedroom. But he had already moved on to another, the 12-year-old Trina McLeod. Gosh. Oh, it's so gross. Oh, man. They should have... Gosh. I'm so glad the story ends where it does, but it takes so long to get there. Like the other girls who fell into McElroy's trap, Trina wanted out. On June 11th, 1973, 2 weeks after giving birth to a boy, Trina asked Alice to help her escape. I mean, at this point, Ken effectively has this huge group of young women trapped in his house who are reliant on him and afraid of him to leave, but also really want to. Alice agreed and went to grab her 2 children, Juarez and Tonya, making up an excuse to McElroy that they were going to visit Trina's baby in the hospital. They fled to one of Trina's relatives' houses to wait until they could be taken somewhere far from northern Missouri. When McElroy discovered where they were hiding, he drove over and threatened the homeowners with a shotgun. Alice and Trina eventually relented and left with McElroy. Later, he drove back to the relative's house, shot their dog, and burned down the house, all while Trina waited in the truck. So it's a teenage girl who he impregnates, has a child with, and then she wants out, so she goes to her family, and her family shelters her. He shows up, threatens to kill him, so she leaves with him. Then he comes back and burns the family's house down. Okay, whatever. It is so frustrating what some monsters get away with because they prey on the expectations of a valuable society. Like, Ken knows the people he's going to encounter aren't built for violence. They're not used to hyper-violence as a means of getting what they want or dispelling disagreements. So he just hurts people over and over and flaunts it in everyone's face. Should the family of Trina's have killed him or, got the police involved or done something to stop him? Absolutely. I don't know their situation. I don't know if it was other young women that Trina went to stay with or like elderly family members who maybe couldn't have done anything. But whatever it is, Ken knew that. Ken knows exactly who he can prey on and for how long. There's a reason he loses interest with women when they're old enough to do something about it. For this, Trina and Alice were raped and terribly beaten as punishment. After a couple of days, Trina, traumatized from the abuse, went to a doctor who immediately prescribed her tranquilizers. Trina was taken to a mental hospital under the custody of the county, and her baby was placed in foster care. On June 19, 1973, another prosecutor filed 3 charges against Ken McElroy for rape, arson, and use of a deadly weapon. Because of Trina's testimony, for the first time in his life, Ken McElroy was at serious risk of arrest, with penalty as harsh as the death penalty even on the table. What McElroy needed next was something he couldn't steal. He needed a good attorney. Ken McElroy went on a crime spree in the later part of 1969 through 1970, accruing 19 separate felony charges against him. And the way he beat those charges was simple enough. There were really only 2 ways. Either delay a case long enough or ensure there were no witnesses to testify. Richard Gene McFadden, a Kansas City trial lawyer, first met McElroy in February of 1972, when McElroy faced 2 charges, the felony crime of assault of Alice's stepfather, and the misdemeanor, previously a felony, of bribing a witness not to testify. McFadden took on both cases, despite not knowing McElroy, and upon meeting him, assumed he was the type of man who could not afford his legal services. McElroy paid cash on the spot, $1,000 up front, out of the total $3,000 for both cases. This would be the beginning of their mutually beneficial relationship. McElroy would constantly need a lawyer, and as a client, he never complained about the fees and always paid in cash. And for McFadden, he would be McElroy's legal shield for the bevy of criminal charges to come. Which insert joke about sleazy lawyers taking money and helping criminals get away with being bad people. Unless, of course, you're one of my viewers, which are a sleazy lawyer, in which case, I guess the joke's about you. McFadden specialized in litigation and claimed to have won 90% of his trials. His impressive reputation in criminal cases was undersold by his short, heavy-set stature. McFadden believed that a case was not won or lost at trial, but during preparation, so he sent investigators to interview every witness, and he followed up on every lead. Eventually, something would come up that the lawyer could rest his case on. But in McElroy's latest criminal charges with Trina, McFadden would have to use every loophole he could to push the law to its maximum limit, and he was determined to get this case dismissed. During this case, the biggest issue for the prosecution would be keeping Trina, the primary witness whose testimony could be the key factor in a guilty verdict, safe and secure. The first step was to arrest McElroy in order to keep him away from Trina. In June of 1973, Ken McElroy was arrested, booked, arraigned, but then released on a $2,500 bail. You may be hearing all these stories and thinking, why did it take so long for something substantial to come against McElroy in the first place? And that's because most of the time his victims were scared to testify against him. If he did steal things, he normally wasn't around to be caught red-handed. And if he was caught, the family would simply be threatened. And as far as these young girls go, he would either marry them or convince them that he still loved them and they don't need to press charges and he wants to be with them and blah, blah, blah. Trina was a big deal because it was the first time they finally had him on the hook for something and someone was willing to say something about it. As for Trina, social workers took her to Knob Foster, and upon losing track of Trina, McElroy was furious. He offered $2,000 for the man who could locate her, while he himself combed Maryville and the neighboring small town to look for her. To stay under the radar, he borrowed cars for travel. But while McElroy was hunting down Trina, Trina was building her case. She told her juvenile officer about McElroy's violent sexual interactions with her, how her parents were too afraid to help her, which I understand Ken's a scary guy. But if you are an able-bodied person and your daughter is going through this situation, I don't care how scared you are. You are culpable if you are not doing something to stop it. A man in his mid-30s is periodically raping your daughter and forcing her to have his children and beating her, and she's too scared to get away. And if you are her parent and you're just like, I'm too afraid, you get the chair too. And you may be like, oh, well, they're doing something about it now. You know, it's going to court. I mean, a bullet. I don't, this guy never should have saw a courthouse in the first place. Someone should have just killed him. I mean, what? He go to jail so we can pay for this guy to continue to breathe for some reason for the next 5 decades? Great. He can get his court-appointed hearing at the pearly gates and preferably 6 feet down from the rest of us. Anyway, that's not, yeah, I'll continue. Trina stayed at multiple foster homes while making court appearances and eventually settled in with Ginger and George Clement in Maryville. The couple, who had 2 daughters of their own, were begged by the social worker to foster Trina as there was nowhere else to place her. They were also warned that McElroy would come looking for her, but the couple agreed to take her in and promised to be around if McElroy appeared. And sure enough, after a few weeks, he did. Ginger came home after work one afternoon and noticed an Oldsmobile parked 30 yards down the street from their house. Inside was a large man with black hair slicked back and bushy eyebrows. It was Ken McElroy. Inside the house, she found Trina crying in the basement, clutching her baby in fear that McElroy would smash the window to take him. Apparently, he had sat there in that car for hours, just staring at the house. Ginger called the police, who came immediately, but relayed to the Clements that McElroy knew the law. As long as he wasn't trespassing or doing anything illegal, there was nothing the authorities could do. Which, I don't know about that one. Like, sure, you can't get him for, like, assault or anything, but if Trina's a protected witness, and this is clearly intimidating a witness, at the very least, it should revoke his bail. This seemed to be straight out of the playbook McElroy used to intimidate witnesses into dropping theft charges. Ginger and George began locking their windows and doors whenever they left Trina home alone. I have no idea why on God's earth they would leave her home alone, but whatever. The Clements couldn't do anything about McElroy staring at them while driving by their property, apparently. And they certainly couldn't stop the menacing phone calls that followed. Every time Ginger answered, a man growled on the other end, quote, "Tell my little bride that I'm coming to get her." Oh my God. McElroy always called Trina his little bride. Ginger refused to let McElroy speak to Trina, so McElroy pressed even further, asking to trade girl for girl. Oh my gosh. I know where the story ends. It has a happy ending. The story has a happy ending. The story has a happy ending. Just keep telling myself that. Ginger couldn't believe what she was hearing. McElroy told Ginger he knew where her daughters went to school and which bus they would take. Okay, that clear as day, not even the witness, just threatening to harm a child. While McElroy stalked the Clements, his lawyer was busy at work. McFadden deployed the strategy to split the charges into 2 separate trials, seeking a change of venue for each. Since the crimes of rape, flourishing a deadly weapon, and arson occurred in Nottoway County, where the charges were also filed, it would be normal for the local magistrate to conduct the hearing. But this person, Montgomery Monty Wilson, disqualified himself. Wilson held a long-standing fear of Ken McElroy, something that everyone knew. According to one prominent citizen, Wilson said of McElroy, quote, "I don't want anything to do with that man. I don't want to get killed." He's not the Grim Reaper. He's a guy. He's made of flesh and meat. You can kill those things. The case was sent to Atchison County under Magistrate Clark Gore, who heard the primary witness, Trina, for charges of rape and arson. Trina's uncle testified along with Skidmore City Marshal on McElroy's charge of brandishing a deadly weapon. The really messed up part about this whole story is that if the criminal justice system had just dealt with these felony charges with any remote semblance of urgency, McElroy might have seen a conviction. But the cases were transferred to other counties on the motion of the defendant. The rape, arson, assault, and weapons cases were sent to Gentry County, while an additional molestation charge, which was filed in February of 1974, went to Platte County. Despite at least 3 different trial dates being set, the court granted continuances. Finally, the trials were all set for the fall of 1974, 3 years after the alleged crimes. And this prolonged waiting period was enough for Ken McElroy to devise a plan. In the summer of 1974, McFadden was sitting at his desk when McElroy appeared in his doorway unannounced. He wanted to know how the cases were looking. McFadden told his client that it would be difficult to win. The cases were tough. Without a beat, McElroy asked, "What happens if I marry Trina?" The lawyer realized his client was onto something. Kill him too. Kill that guy too. Kill that guy too. Oh my gosh. Oh, just all of them. Just clean slate. Oh. If McElroy and Trina were married, then she couldn't testify against him, and the courts would have no case. Because in Missouri, spousal immunity is a form of marital privilege, under which the state cannot compel a witness to testify against her husband. Now, Trina could still testify if she chose to, but all that Ken has to do is his standard brand of manipulation and threatening. The only problem was that McElroy was still married to Sharon. A few days later, as if by some divine intervention, and by divine intervention I mean McElroy's threatening, Sharon appeared in McFadden's office seeking a divorce. McFadden quickly arranged a dissolution, but now needed Trina's parents to voluntarily agree to a marriage since Trina was still only 15 years old. Trina's mother, who knew what McElroy was capable of if she refused, showed up in McFadden's office and gave her consent to the marriage. The lawyer had her write and sign a notarized statement affirming no coercion was involved. And a few days later, the prosecutor couldn't believe that his only witness, who was a victim in several of the felonies, was now married to the accused. There has to come a moment in these things. There has to come a point where the onlookers are responsible. I get Ken McElroy's a scary guy, and I get he's threatening your family, and he's going to hurt you, and stuff like that. But again, he's not immortal, right? And I know it can be scary to take that level of action to, endanger your life or the life of, people around you or your husband or whatever, whoever was involved in the situation. I understand that it can be a lot to take matters into your own hands to that degree. But at some point, being scared does not cut it. Think if the situation was changed. Imagine your house is on fire and your child's in another room. Fires are scary. You don't want to be in a house that's on fire, but what are you going to do? Run out without getting your kid? At some point, being that afraid makes you just as culpable as everyone else. And for that mother to go in there and sign over her 15-year-old daughter back to this man who, sure, he's probably manipulated into thinking that she wants this and it's her choice and he's going to love her and be nice to her and blah, blah, blah. But for that mother who knows better to walk into McFadden's office and for McFadden to institute all of this, the level of proximal evil that is happening for Ken McElroy to continue to be a bastard it's sickening. I understand that a lot of people don't want to fight back, especially if it's to the point of violence, but at some point, not fighting back is its own sin. I remember there's this story I always heard about my extended family growing up, and I can't remember names, or I think these are people I've never met, but that up in Appalachia, like back in the 50s, some family member had a daughter who some creepy guy in town had been perving on for a while, and she came to her dad and said she was scared, and he was supposed to come by soon. So that night, her brother and her dad just waited up. Sure enough, that guy comes to the house to come get her, and they shot him to death on the front porch. You know why that guy who they shot to death doesn't have a story like Ken McElroy? Why he didn't continue a series of torment, hurting more children and breaking families and girls left and right? It's because someone did something. Because sure, it was probably scary. I mean, they didn't know what was going to happen to them. But at some point, that doesn't matter anymore. At some point, someone's got to pick up a gun before Ken does. And I know the story gets there eventually, but my gosh, the suffering that had to happen for it to get there is heartbreaking. The prosecutor weighed his options, as Missouri's husband-wife privileges did recognize a few exceptions, quote, which included that a spouse is not prohibited from testifying about crimes committed by the other spouse against him or her. However, from a practical standpoint, how would it look in court if the jury heard Trina testify that she had been raped by the defendant only to marry him 1 year later? Of course, not to say that that's impossible, but the prosecution understood that Ken's attorneys were pulling everything to get this case dropped. So if the prosecution's trying to argue that everything that happened was unconsenting, of course, Ken's attorney is going to side with the idea that all of it's made up because here Trina is not testifying and now married to the defendant. Now, in hindsight, the prosecution could have explored other options, such as filing a motion for a hearing, bringing the circumstances to the court's attention, and even attacking the marriage itself and proving that, if anything, this was a continuation of McElroy's abuse and coercion of the defendant, all part of his plan to maintain control, which it obviously was. But unfortunately, this would have been difficult to prove, because Trina signed a statement that was sworn in by McFadden's office, in which she made clear that she did not want to, quote, engage in any criminal or legal actions against Kenneth McElroy, and that she desired the charges against him dropped, in which she was the prosecuting witness. If the only witness says she wants the charges dropped, it's hard for the prosecution to carry on. So, on October 24th, 1974, the prosecutor filed papers dismissing the felony charges. Both the prosecutor and the juvenile officer felt that they had done their best to protect Trina, and her choosing to marry McElroy was her own business, as was whatever happened to her afterward. The only charge that went to trial was that of McElroy brandishing a deadly weapon. However, a key witness never showed, and McElroy was acquitted by a jury. With the rape, arson, and child molestation charges now dropped, news of McElroy's victories rattled the small towns of Skidmore, Graham, and Maitland. Northern Missouri had gone after the monster who terrorized its people with the full might of the justice system. Cops, prosecutors, judges, and they all failed to bring him down. An upsetting precedent had now been set. Ken McElroy was free to bully, assault, and torment anyone he wanted to, anywhere he pleased, and seemingly at any time. And now, doing all of that without consequence, he was emboldened. On July 27th, 1976, 2 years after McElroy escaped nearly a dozen felony charges, a Skidmore farmer named Romaine Henry heard gunshots while working in his equipment shed and immediately got into his truck to investigate the source of the sound on his 1,000-acre property. Henry stopped as he came upon McElroy's parked truck just outside of Henry's farm. McElroy was holding a shotgun and approached Henry. Henry, hearing gunshots and seeing this guy standing just off his property, was confused. Even more so when McElroy shouted, quote, "Were you the dirty son of a bitch over at my place in a white Pontiac?" Henry struggled to give him an answer, having no clue what McElroy was talking about. McElroy shouted at Henry again, this time firing the shotgun, hitting Henry in the torso. McElroy fired again, this time buckshot tore into Henry's forehand and his right cheek. As McElroy's shotgun jammed, Henry used the opportunity to speed off, and eventually, his wife took him to a hospital in Maryville. When McElroy was arrested the following day, he was charged with assault with intent to kill. McElroy denied shooting the farmer, denying that he was even at the scene. McFadden used his usual tactics to help his client, requesting different locations for court appearances and multiple trial delays. McElroy used his tactic of intimidation. Between the shooting and the trial, Ken drove by or parked outside Henry's home dozens of times, and by some accounts, well over 100. Henry pleaded with the sheriff, who told the farmer that he'd talked to McElroy. Regardless of whether the talk happened or not, the visits continued. Henry had two other witnesses who said they saw the suspect drive away from the scene just after the shooting. McFadden, however, brought his own two witnesses who said they were with McElroy at the time of the shooting, far from Henry's farm. The trial was postponed a year, and in August of 1977, jurors voted to acquit unanimously. The two independent witnesses who vouched for McElroy were enough evidence for him to be found innocent. Several months later, Ken went to Henry's farm and fired a rifle at Henry, who was on his tractor. McElroy had delivered his closing statement. So now, because of this attorney, McElroy can just get away with trying to kill people. April 25th, 1980 would see a McElroy-led assault on behalf of people other than himself, his children. Or perhaps they were just scapegoats, a convenient outlet for his violent outburst. When several of his children stopped by a Skidmore grocery store to buy some candy, there was confusion over payment at the cash register. One of the younger children walked outside with candy that hadn't been paid for yet. The owners, Louis and Bo Bowenkamp, apparently tried to resolve the disagreement through discussion, but an older sister went flush with anger or humiliation for her sibling being accused of stealing. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. To the surprise of no one, McElroy showed up with a knife in his hand along with Trina, who shouted obscenities at Lois, threatening to, quote, whip her ass. The owners tried to explain that they were not accusing the children of stealing, simply pointing out that some candy had not been purchased. At first, the McElroys seemed to calm down, but when Ken tried to purchase a pack of cigarettes, both Louis and Bo Bowenkamp refused and said the family was barred from the store. McElroy sat in his truck outside the store later that evening and stared. When the owners went home, McElroy drove his truck past their home repeatedly throughout the night. The next morning, Lois went to file a report at the sheriff's office in Ottaway County, where she was told the report would be reviewed by a prosecutor. In the meantime, she was advised to keep an eye on McElroy. Lois laughed, knowing that nothing would be done. And she was right. Nothing was done. The sheriff never filed a report, interviewed McElroy, or sought witnesses. A few nights later, McElroy returned to the Bowenkamp's home and fired gunshots outside. July 8, 1980, after being continuously stalked and intimidated, Bo finally confronted McElroy outside the store, who pulled a shotgun on him and pulled the trigger. Bo Bowenkamp spent 10 days in the hospital suffering a gunshot wound to the neck, but miraculously survived. So, after stalking the Bowenkamps for several days, Ken shows up outside of the store. Bo goes outside of his business to confront Ken, and then Ken shoots Bo. Surely to God, this would mean he finally gets charged with something, right? Once again, McElroy began mounting his defense. He told anyone that would listen that Bowenkamp was the instigator who menaced him with a butcher knife. Ken claimed that he only fired his gun out of self-defense. A minister went over to the Bowenkamps to comfort them. Angry at the minister, McElroy made threatening phone calls and even confronted David Dunbar, a part-time town marshal, to ask if he would testify against him in the Bowenkamp case. Dunbar told him that it was very possible he'd be put on the stand, and McElroy then took his shotgun from his truck and pointed it at the marshal, saying, quote, "I'll kill anybody who would put me in jail."
If anyone says that I shot at this guy, I'll kill you.
But also just, it speaks to the level of audacity and the ego this guy feels that he can point a gun at a marshal so that the marshal is intimidated to not testify into attempted murder. Like, just the level of brazen. Like, how does a part-time marshal not pull his gun back, right? How does that not result in a shootout? It blows my mind. Despite managing to calm McElroy down, the next morning, Dunbar turned in his badge. He decided that it wasn't worth risking his life over a job. Not only did McElroy have residents terrified of him, he had total power over the local authorities. All right, you know what? Maybe this dude is the Grim Reaper. Maybe he was walking around like with a giant scythe and he had a hood over his head and he could just float everywhere he went. Because surely that's the only reason everyone would be so stupid to not do something. He is a guy. I don't care if he's tall. I don't care if he's strong. I don't care if he looks mean. That's a human. You can kill those things. But it wasn't just Skidmore residents and police. McElroy was even brazen enough to threaten the state trooper who arrested him, Richard Stratton. In addition to intimidating phone calls to the Stratton home, McElroy slow-rolled his truck past his house, which frightened the trooper's wife, Margaret. The town of Skidmore treated Ken McElroy as if he were the town boogeyman. According to Bowenkamp's daughter, quote, "The town emptied every time he came to town. Everyone was so uncomfortable and scared. The people of Skidmore hoped that McElroy's trial would end their nightmare." I mean, like, just get, if you guys can't do it yourself, get Batman involved, get, I don't know, the National Guard, someone. McFadden was able to get a venue change for the trial about 75 miles outside of Skidmore to Bethany, Missouri. He was also able to delay the trial to June 25, 1981, nearly a full year from the shooting. Similar to the trial of Romaine Henry, McElroy dragged a witness from within his hunting circle who testified in his defense. She claimed to have seen Bo Bowenkamp lunge at McElroy on the day of the shooting. The witness could not, however, explain why it took her 9 months to come forward with this information. After the jury heard both lawyers' closing statements, they quickly voted to convict Ken McElroy of assault, which finally, thank God. The option for a life sentence in prison was very much in play, but under Missouri law during that time, the jurors were not given any information about the convicted's patterns of behavior, which again, that's just a really stupid law. I'm glad it doesn't exist that way anymore. Oh, this dude assaulted someone? Well, we'll convict him. Okay, but you're not allowed to know if this is like a thing that happens a lot or just a one-off. Okay, got it. That makes sense to us, the lawmakers, for some reason. This was because, despite his 24 failed criminal charges, McElroy had a clean rap sheet. Again, because everything kept getting thrown out for stupid reasons. After much deliberation, the jury settled on a 2-year sentence. Following the announcement, however, the judge kept McElroy's bail in place and released him after a 25-day appeal window. Richard McFadden proved to be McElroy's golden escape hatch, but what both himself and Ken would soon come to learn was the difference between the justice system and actual justice. This latter kind of justice would fall outside of McFadden and McElroy's control. Thankfully, the residents of Skidmore had been pushed to their brink. They could no longer stand by and let McElroy continue his reign of terror uncontested. A retired farmer named Pete Ward was so disgusted with the lack of punishment that he rallied his sons and a few others to protect the Bowenkamps and their property. The townsfolk of Skidmore planned to travel to the hearing in Bethany to oppose McElroy's seemingly unending freedom. They prepared to meet at the Skidmore Legion Hall on the morning of the hearing and traveled to the trial as one unified voice. However, on July 10th, McFadden was able to postpone the trial for another 10 days. The lawyer called McElroy and advised him to stay out of Skidmore for the time being, and his client didn't listen. Despite the hearing being pushed to July 20th, most of the men in Skidmore decided to go to the Legion and discuss their concerns. The main topic would be how to protect themselves from McElroy. The group even brought in a sheriff from Maryville to help answer their questions. They wanted to know if they were allowed to patrol each other's homes and farms. This really goes to show that thing I was talking earlier about people like preying on a trusting society, because you have Ken who's never cared about the law. He's gonna use it to skirt the boundaries to get away with what he wants to do without directly being convicted of anything. He's going to show up outside of witnesses' houses. He's going to shoot at people. He's going to claim it was self-defense. He doesn't care. But then you have the good people, like the ones who try to maintain some semblance of societal order, asking the sheriff if they're allowed to do safety patrols. The law in this case is only shackling the good people and giving free rein to the monster. I also want you to think about the situation. Everyone knows that because Ken's out now, he's probably going to do something to the Bowenkamps. And worst case scenario, at the end of this hearing, he might get 2 years and then he's back out to do the same thing again. And this has been going on for decades now, not to mention all the girls and families he's hurt. So they're in there talking about the best way that they can keep people safe so that people aren't afraid of the boogeyman anymore. And then while they're sitting in there, the group hears that McElroy and Trina were at the tavern. The tavern just outside of where they're all gathered. So they decided to confront Ken as a group. Before heading back to Maryville, the sheriff advised them not to get into a confrontation, but then wisely, the sheriff left, ensuring that he wasn't around for what followed. On that day, July 10th, McElroy drank beer at D&G Tavern and ordered cigarettes and Rolaids. Trina would later tell the New York Times that there was a, quote, air of unease that night. She recounted how there were no people anywhere, despite vehicles lining the street. Then, suddenly, the tavern was filled with people. Everyone was drinking beers, but nobody was paying for them. Around 30 men went inside the tavern, including some who had never been seen in the bar before. McElroy decided that he wanted to go home, so he ordered a six-pack to go and walked out with Trina to his truck. Most of the men in the tavern followed them outside, where Trina got into the passenger seat while McElroy stared the men down from the driver's seat. As he lit a cigarette and started the engine, Trina saw a rifle raised. She tried to warn her husband, but it was too late. 2 rifle shots rang out from the left, followed by 4 more from the back of the truck, and possibly more shots from other directions. Some of the men hit the ground. Trina, who had her husband's blood splattered on her clothes, was pulled out of the truck by some of the other men. Nobody called for an ambulance. Someone reported a shooting of some kind in Skidmore, and when the sheriff from Maryville arrived, residents discovered that it was the same one who advised the group not to get into a confrontation with McElroy. As he attempted to make his report, the sheriff found that every witness was either unable to name an assailant or claimed not to have seen who fired the shots. What the sheriff did know was that Kenneth McElroy finally was dead. His truck filled with bullet holes, and his blood and teeth lay on the dashboard. Oh man. It just feels so good. This just feels so good. Trina had been a victim of his for over a decade, from the children he forced upon her to the continued rape and trauma and abuse that her entire family was subject to. And the group of men who go to confront him see him sitting there, and I'm sure there was an air amongst them that this was going to continue. And especially seeing Trina there, as young as she is, you know it had to run all over them, that this monster has her in his clutches, and there really is no court-appointed solution for this guy, is there? So they get out there, and one or two or several guys unload their shots on the car, and then other guys are already staged on the passenger side to pull Trina out to make sure she isn't hurt. And then as soon as the shooting's done, all the guns disappear and no one saw who did it. How perfect. On July 20th, several days after McElroy was buried, a task force turned over its evidence to a Nottoway County prosecutor named Bard. It became clear immediately that witnesses were unwilling to talk about what they saw the day McElroy was shot, so a task force of 23 officers from various law enforcement agencies in northwest Missouri was summoned to Skidmore. After much deliberation, they compiled a list of 35 men who they believed were present at the scene of the crime. Trina McElroy identified a local rancher as one of the gunmen, most likely the one who raised his rifle first, but when approached, the rancher denied Trina's claims. One Missouri officer assigned to the task force told reporters that out of the 35 leads they had, none of them heard anything or saw anything. One of the troopers, Dan Boyer, who was one of the first officers at the scene, was chided by a town official. When Skidmore needed their help the most, he said, these officers had done nothing. Boyer had his own encounters with McElroy. The officer had once pulled Ken over for speeding, and later that evening, a pickup truck cruised up and down the street outside of Boyer's remote country house. As you can imagine, the town was upset by this investigation. For decades, we've put up with this guy running amok in our community, but the moment we do something about it, now the investigators show up. Trina, law enforcement officers, and several other witnesses, including Skidmore's mayor, its postmaster, and a D&G bartender, gave their testimony to county jurors. The ruling was that McElroy died from bullets fired by a person or persons unknown. As a result, the insufficient evidence warranted no arrest. Several weeks later, a Missouri grand jury convened across 15 sessions to hear evidence from the same witnesses as the county panel, as well as Skidmore sheriff, and the two men McElroy was accused of shooting. Those two men, of course, being Romaine Henry and Bo Bowenkamp. The state grand jury also heard from Dale Clement, a farmer and son of the co-owner of the D&G Tavern. On September 25th, the state grand jury ended its investigation with no indictment. Although Clement was one of the shooters identified by Trina in her testimony, no witnesses could or would corroborate her identifying them, and the grand jury concluded that Trina's testimony was not sufficient enough to warrant an indictment. Oh man, this feels so good. For years, Ken had intimidated witnesses over and over to get them to say, I didn't see anything. No, I have no idea who you're talking about. That guy's innocent. And now, when he finally pushed the town so far, he gets murdered in front of like 2 or 3 dozen witnesses. And when they're asked, not out of fear, but out of their sense of community and their sense of understanding of what needed done, they're all saying, I didn't see who did it. That guy's innocent. Oh. The U.S. Justice Department ordered a federal investigation conducted by the FBI. Agents combed through witness statements and met with everyone involved with McElroy's murder, and in the spring of 1982, a federal grand jury heard testimony from those same witnesses. Later that fall, in September, the federal investigation ended exactly like all the others, without an indictment. Bard, who was given what the feds called, quote, important new evidence, reviewed the material but was unchanged. He determined there was not enough from the feds to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I love it too. I love the local judicial system also being in on the game and being like,
Yeah, I don't see what you're talking about.
can't convict. Sorry. Obviously, there's several cases historically of like local community sense of justice going the other direction, and you have like crooked judges and crooked like towns members and politicians who let bad things continue for the sake of profit or whatever. But it's just nice to see like a crooked local system in the other direction, an anti-crooked system, that will bend the rules to make sure that people who did what was right don't get charged for it. Richard McFadden filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit in 1984 on the behalf of Trina McElroy, seeking $6 million. The defendants, which included the sheriff, Mayor Peter, and Del Clement, settled out of court for $17,600, which the county ended up paying a majority of. No one admitted guilt, and apparently the settlement was made to curtail legal fees should the suit go forward. Trina McElroy moved away from Skidmore and eventually remarried. Bo Bowenkamp died a decade after McElroy's murder. His widow still lives in the same house. And this time, there's no monster outside stalking the property at night. The story of Ken McElroy's murder eventually made its way outside of Missouri, and in 1988, a book recounting the events, written by Harry N. McLean, In Broad Daylight, was adapted into a made-for-TV movie of the same name. The film starred Brian Denny, Cloris Leachman, Marcia Gay Harden, and Chris Cooper. As for McElroy himself, yes, the conditions in which he was raised fostered a unique survival skill that few of his siblings developed: the power of intimidation. It became a weapon that he wielded after realizing that fear was a far more reliable institution than the one that failed to convict him. Maybe it was the abandonment of his father's love that taught young McElroy that a career of theft, assault, and terror was a path to overcome poverty and gain the social leverage he never had as a kid. This would also be the same path that led to his downfall. Of course, his roots are sympathetic. If you saw a child in that situation, you would feel bad for them. But at some point, the child becomes the man. Perhaps Ken's dad, Tony, also had a bad upbringing. Perhaps that's what led him there. Doesn't matter, though, because Tony was the adult that caused the trouble. Maybe his father before him and his. At some point, the victim becomes the monster. And at some point, that monster cannot create another victim. The people of Skidmore were not a frenzied mob. They were an exhausted community pushed to the brink after a system that was supposed to protect them failed. In the end, that system only succeeded in protecting their assailant, a justice system that prevents justice. Maybe it was Ken McElroy's example that taught them that sometimes the only way to win is to operate outside of that system. That playing by the rules just means you're playing on an uneven field. McElroy never operated within the lines, and this mindset helped him do anything he pleased until he was ruling the whole town with an iron fist. Once a group of law-abiding citizens decided to discard that system and do what they felt they had to do, they gained the power and leverage to dispose of their enemy, the same way he had disposed of them and the young women who lived among them. Look, as a Christian, I understand that there is nothing more heavy than the taking of a soul. Right. And as a Christian, I also always understand that there is the possibility of redemption and the possibility of recompense. But Ken McElroy had his chances, and he was using every one of them to hurt more people. I cannot think of a single thing that was brought better in the world as long as he was breathing, but I can think of a lot that got better after he quit. In the words of John Ruth from The Hateful Eight, you only gotta hang mean bastards. But mean bastards, you gotta hang. There are few cases, like in criminal history, that get me as fired up as this one. On both sides of it, I'm fired up by the fact this guy was allowed to exist and get away with his crimes for as long as he did, and the number of people who were implicit to what this monster was doing. But I also get fired up by a group of good people realizing that maybe today, enough is enough. And for the decades that follow, we are going to keep a secret to make sure that people who did something that needed done don't get in trouble for it. It is a story that is equally as tragic as it is encouraging. And hopefully if you stuck around this long, you agree at least a little bit, and I really appreciate it. And we just want to say thank you for watching. I got a little bit opinionated in this video, perchance, but you know what? It's a YouTube video, not a WeTube video or a documentary tube video or whatever. It's what I want to talk about, and I want to talk about how mad and excited I get over this case, and that's what you got, so you're welcome. A bunch of the topics that are coming up on this channel are ones I've been interested in for a while, and for one reason or the other have decided not to cover over on Wendigoon, and this was one of them. I've thought about making a video over on Wendigoon for a bit, but honestly, all of the details here are pretty much everything. And there wasn't really an angle I wanted to tackle it more than giving the information and just getting real wound up. So I thought it was a good fit over here, and hopefully you all agreed. And a lot of the upcoming topics are in a similar vein, so if you enjoyed this, hopefully you want to stay tuned for those. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some love. New uploads here Mondays at noon, except of course when I am, taking vacations over the summer and maybe a little late to some of those uploads, in which case, oops. Be sure to check out Wendigoon and Wendigoon Links for more content as well. All in all, I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! I'm still mad, by the way, at Trina's parents. Like, you're just gonna let that happen. You're just not gonna do anything. I bet, they shouldn't have done this. I'm not advocating they should have done this, but if that mob wanted to be really cool, then maybe, after they deal with him, they're like, and where's that attorney's office at? And where's that? Well, then you literally have an angry mob walking through the street with like pitchforks and torches, which, maybe not a bad thing. Maybe there's a few places that could use a few more angry mobs from time to time. That would be cool.